This is the Omnivore's Dilemma, Young Reader's Edition, Chapter 22, the final chapter, starting on page 304. Chapter 22, The Perfect Meal. Perfect? A dangerous boast, you must be thinking. And in truth, my do-it-yourself meal did not come out exactly as I hoped. The dessert, a cherry tart, was slightly burned. The morels were a little gritty. The salt I had gathered in San Francisco Bay was too toxic to serve. But for me, it was still the perfect meal. I set the date for the dinner, Saturday, June 18th, as soon as my animal was in the bag. Wild California pig would be the main course. That gave me a couple of weeks to plan and gather the rest of the menu. I made myself some rules for what I would include. Number 1. Everything on the menu must have been hunted, gathered, or grown by me. Number 2. The menu should include at least one animal, vegetable, and fungus, as well as an edible mineral, the salt. 3. Everything served must be in season and fresh. 4. I would spend no money on the meal, but I could use items I already had in my pantry. 5. The guest list was limited to those who helped me in my foraging and their partners. This included Angelo, Anthony, Richard, and a friend named Sue who took me chanterelle hunting. Plus, of course, my wife Judith and son Isaac. Unfortunately, Jean-Pierre was in France. There would be 10 of us in all. 6. I would cook the meal myself. As with any set of rules, I soon found I needed to break one. The problem was the salt. I had learned that there are still a few salt ponds in the bottom of San Francisco Bay. On the Saturday before my dinner, a very good-natured friend and I drove down to a lonely stretch of shoreline beneath the San Mateo Bridge. After an endless trek through trash-strewn wetlands, we found the salt ponds, rectangular fields of shallow water. The water was the color of strong tea. The shores were littered with garbage. There were soda cans and bottles, car parts and tires, and hundreds of tennis balls abandoned by dogs. There was everything except salt. There had been heavy rains all spring, making the ponds deeper than usual. There were no white salt crystals on the rocks, as I'd expected. We ended up filling a couple of soda bottles with the cloudy brown brine. That night, I evaporated the liquid in a pan over a low flame. The kitchen filled with a smelly chemical steam, but after a few hours there was a layer of brown crystals in the bottom of the pan. Once it cooled, I managed to scrape out a few tablespoons. The salt I wound up with was greasy and tasted so much like chemicals it actually made me gag. Here was a good example of how disgust can save your life. No doubt professional salt gatherers have better ways to purify their salt, but I had no clue what these might be. So I abandoned plans to cook with or serve my own salt and counted myself lucky to have survived. Perhaps the hardest rule to obey was the one about freshness. I was trying to bring to the table wild pig, wild mushrooms, fresh local fruit, and garden-picked vegetables all at the same time. Once again, I had to bend the rules since there are no good local mushrooms in the Bay Area in June. Luckily, I had dried a pound of the morels that I'd gathered the previous month. I decided to use those. At least I had gathered them myself. For the appetizer, I turned to the garden, where there were fava beans ready to pick. I'd planted them back in November, and by May I had scores of fat, glossy pods. The fava is a broad, flat, bright green shelling bean. If picked young and quickly boiled, it has a starchy sweet taste that reminds me of springtime just as much as fresh peas or asparagus. But by June, many of my beans were not so young anymore, so I decided to make fava bean toasts. I'd mash the beans with roasted garlic and sage and serve them on toasted rounds of homemade sourdough bread. The younger, sweeter beans I'd reserve for the pasta. For a second appetizer, I asked Angelo to bring a block of the pâté he'd made from the liver of my pig. So yes, okay, here was another exception to the rules. Angelo made the pâté. I also asked him to make the pasta for the first course. Morels sautéed in butter with thyme, and for color, the tiny fava beans over fresh egg fettuccine. Wild California pig was the main course, but which cut and how to prepare it? Angelo recommended slowly braising the leg, in his opinion the most flavorful cut. To braise it, I'd first sear it in a frying pan and then slow roast it in liquid. I was curious to try the loin, and grilling outdoors over a fire seemed to me more in keeping with the hunter-gatherer theme. Unable to choose between the two approaches, I decided to try both. I would braise the leg in red wine, Angelo's, and homemade stock. The loin I would brine overnight to keep the lean meat from drying out on the grill, cover it with crushed peppercorns, and then grill it fairly quickly over olive wood. I wanted to bake my own bread and decided it was fitting to use wild yeast. That would introduce a second type of fungus to the menu. Yeast is what makes bread dough rise. The yeast eat the sugars in bread dough and as a byproduct give off carbon dioxide. The bubbles of gas create little pockets in the dough. That's what gives bread its light and spongy texture. Bakers buy yeast in packets to add to their dough, but there's also wild yeast in the air. I found a recipe that gave instructions for gathering wild yeast in a process that took several days but didn't sound too difficult. After the main course, there would be a salad. I had originally hoped to make it with foraged wild greens. Earlier in the spring, I had found a lush patch of miner's lettuce and wild rapini in the Berkeley Hills, but by June the greens had begun to yellow. I decided to go instead with a simple salad of lettuces from my garden. That left dessert, and for a while that posed a problem. My plan was to forage fruit for a tart from one of the many fruit trees lining the streets in Berkeley. I see no reason why foraging for food should be restricted to the countryside. In the weeks before the dinner, I went on several urban scouting expeditions. In other words, I strolled around my neighborhood with a plastic bag. Since moving to Berkeley, I've located a handful of excellent fruit trees: plum, apple, apricot, and fig. They all had branches I could reach from public land, but none of them had quite ripened yet. It was my sister-in-law, Dina, who saved my dessert. She reported that her neighbor's Bing cherry tree was so heavy with ripe fruit that several of its branches were at that very moment bending low over her backyard. I decided to make sure it was legal to pick fruit from someone else's tree that is hanging over your yard. It is, and I did. Bingo! Bing cherries for my tart. With dessert, I would serve an herbal tea made from wild chamomile. I'd picked the chamomile flowers in the Berkeley Hills earlier in the spring and dried them. Then I mixed them with mint and lemon balm from the garden. I also had a jar of honey made by a friend in town. You could say the honey was foraged too, by the bees who made it. Now I had my menu and I wrote it out on a card. Being in Berkeley, home to many fine restaurants, I felt compelled to add a few over-the-top menu flourishes. Tonight's specials: fava bean toast and Sonoma boar pate, egg fettuccine with power fire morels, braised leg and grilled loin of wild Sonoma pig, wild East Bay yeast levain, very local garden salad, Fulton Street Bing cherry tart, Claremont Canyon chamomile tea, 2003 Angelo Garo Petite Syrah. The last item was one of Angelo's homemade wines. I started cooking Saturday's meal on Tuesday morning when I made the stock and started the wild yeast culture for the bread. For the stock, I used bones from both my pig and from a grass-fed steer. After roasting the bones in the oven for an hour, I simmered them for the rest of the day in a stock pot with the vegetables and some herbs. Gathering wild yeast turns out to be no big deal. The spores of various yeasts are floating in the air just about everywhere. Collecting them is a matter of giving them a moist place to rest and something to eat. Some species of yeast taste better than others, however, and this is where geography and luck enter in. The Bay Area has a reputation for its sourdough bread, so I figured the air outside my house would be an excellent hunting ground for wild yeast. I made a thick soup of organic flour and spring water. I briefly exposed the mixture to the air on a windowsill, then sealed it in an airtight container. By the following morning, the surface of the chef, as it's called, was bubbling like pancake batter on a hot griddle. That was a good sign, because it meant the yeasts were already at work and growing. Wednesday morning, I drove into San Francisco to pick up the meat from Angelo. By the end of the week, I had all my ingredients. I picked a gallon of cherries, harvested my fava beans, prepared the brine for the pig loin, made the stock, and soaked the dried morels in warm water. On Friday night, when I had made a to-do list and schedule for Saturday, it hit me just how much I had to do. What was really scary was how much of it I had never done before. That included baking a wild yeast bread and cooking a wild pig 2 different ways. I also hadn't added up how many total hours of oven time the meal would require. Braising the pig leg at 250 degrees would take half the day. I didn't see exactly how I could fit in the bread and the tart. For some reason, it hadn't dawned on me earlier that I was cooking a very difficult meal for a group of very picky food experts. Now, dawn on me it did. To give you an idea of exactly what I'd gotten myself into, here's the schedule I wrote out Friday evening on both sides of an index card. I'm going to put this picture of this schedule in the Nearpod. That was my plan for Saturday in the kitchen. Of course, in reality, the day unfolded nothing like that neat and orderly schedule. Instead, it was a blizzard of rushed work, missing ingredients, unscheduled spills and dropped pots, unscheduled trips to the store, unscheduled pangs of doubt and second guessing. There were moments when I sorely wished for another pair of hands, but Judith and Isaac were away all day. Did I really need to cook the pig 2 different ways? For dessert, why not just serve the cherries in a bowl? Or open a packet of fast-acting yeast? Why in the world was I going to this much trouble? When I thought about it, there seemed to be several reasons. This meal was my way of thanking all the people who had helped me with my hunting and gathering adventure. The effort I put into the meal would be a way of showing how much I appreciated what they had done. A bowl of fresh Bing cherries is nice, but to turn them into pastry is surely a more thoughtful gesture. As long as I didn't blow the crust. It's the difference between a Hallmark e-card and a handwritten letter. The work was also a way of honoring the food. All these plants and animals and fungi were being sacrificed to our needs and desires. I wanted to do right by them. I guess I could have made wild boar hamburgers, but that wouldn't have felt like the right thing. Maybe that is one way a cook celebrates the ingredients, by wasting as little as possible and making the most of whatever the food has to offer. It remains to be seen whether my cooking would honor my ingredients or just embarrass me. In any case, by the hour set for the dinner, everything was more or less ready, except me. I raced upstairs to change, and before I had my shoes tied, heard the doorbell ring. The guests were arriving. They came bearing gifts. Angelo with his wine and pâté, Sue with a bouquet picked from her garden. Anthony brought a bottle of homemade nocino, a jet-black Italian liquor he'd made from green walnuts, yet another gift from the forest for our feast. Most of the guests were strangers to one another. All they had in common was foraging and me. But as we settled into the living room with our glasses of wine, it didn't take long for the conversation to start flowing. The fava bean toasts and boar pâté went over well, and that led to a discussion about boar hunting. I disappeared into the kitchen to ready the pasta course. Within minutes, Angelo appeared at my side with an offer of help. I think he was a little worried I was in over my head. While we waited for the pasta water to come to a boil, I asked him to taste the morels. "It's good, but maybe it needs a little more butter." I handed him a stick, and he dropped the whole thing in the pan. So that's how the professionals do it. We dished out the pasta, and I called everyone to the table for dinner. Candles were lit, wine was poured, the perfume of thyme and morels filled the room, and I raised my glass for a toast. I'd actually meant to write out something earlier, but the day had gotten away from me, so I kept it simple. I went around the table and spoke of each person's contribution to my foraging education and to this meal. I talked about Sue's generosity in sharing 3 of her choicest chanterelle spots. I talked about Anthony's allowing a complete and completely green stranger to accompany him hunting morels in the Sierra. I talked about hunting with Richard in Sonoma during that first failed outing. And lastly, I talked about all the many things I'd learned from Angelo. Things about mushrooms and pigs, about nature and the arts of cooking and eating well, and so much else besides. Then, worried I was in danger of melting down into sentiment, I raised my glass again and urged everyone to start. I had actually wanted to say something more. to express a wider gratitude for the meal we were about to eat. I guess I chickened out, afraid that to offer words of thanks for the pig and the mushrooms and the forest and the garden would come off sounding corny. The words I was reaching for, of course, were the words of grace. As you might expect, the talk at the table was mainly about food. Yet this was not the usual food talk of recipes and restaurants. These foragers talked about the plants and animals and fungi they had seen and met. They told stories of an oak forest in Sonoma, a pine burn in the Sierras, and a backyard in Berkeley. The stories brought all these places and the creatures in them to our table. Every item on our plates had a story, and not the kind of story printed on a milk carton about organic cows. These were stories the people at the table had lived. The food, the places it came from, and the eaters at the table were all linked together. How different this was from the typical meal, in which we never even think about where the chicken or cherries come from. How completely different from a fast food hamburger wolfed down without a moment's thought in a speeding car. I don't want to make too much of it. It was just a meal after all. A very tasty meal too, I don't mind saying. The wild pig was delicious both ways, with a nutty sweetness to it that tasted nothing like store-bought pork. The sauce for the leg was almost joltingly rich and earthy, powerfully reminiscent of the forest. So were the morels in butter, or perhaps I should say butter and morels, which had a deep, smoky, almost meaty flavor. I could have done a better job cleaning the grit from the morels, and the tart was a shade overcooked. But the cherries themselves tasted like little bursts of summer on the tongue, and no one seemed to have any trouble polishing it off. In the end, I did feel it was a perfect meal. It wasn't my cooking that made it perfect, but the connection we felt with the food, with the place we live, and with each other. Wasn't that exactly the feeling of connection I had been looking for when I began my journey along the food chain of the U.S.? This food had never worn a label or barcode or price tag, and yet I almost knew everything there was to know about it. I knew and could picture the very oaks and pines that had nourished the pigs and the mushrooms that were nourishing us. And I knew the true cost of this food, that precise amount of time and work it had taken to get it and prepare it. If I had to give this dinner a name, it would have to be the Omnivore's Thanksgiving. I certainly felt thankful to be eating those plants, animals, and fungi. I was thankful to have experienced them in full as living creatures and not as items shrink-wrapped in the supermarket. And I was thankful to be in the company of friends who appreciated the miracle of it all. Of course, it was just one meal. The day after, I would go back to shopping at the supermarket or farmer's market. It was just not realistic for me to find and prepare meals like this more than once in a while. Most people will never be able to do it. Does that mean that we are doomed to eating at the end of a long industrial food chain and never know where our food comes from or what its true nature is? I hope not. Eating with awareness is one of the basic joys of life, and one that everyone can experience even without hunting and gathering your food. One of the wonders of my do-it-yourself meal was how little it had damaged the world. My pig's place in the forest would soon be taken by another pig. The morels would come up again when they needed to. The cherry tree would bear fruit again next year. The meal was fully paid for in every sense. There was no pollution or packaging left over. There were no hidden costs or waste to be disposed of. The fast food meal seems cheap, but as we have seen, the costs are actually enormous. The industrial food chain costs each and every one of us in government spending, in pollution, in global warming, and in our health. You can say that my forager's meal is unrealistic, but I would answer that fast food meal is unrealistic also. It is not realistic to rely on a food system that poisons the planet. It is not realistic to call something a food system when it replaces food with an industrial product that does not nourish us and in fact makes us sick. Imagine if we had a food system that actually produced wholesome food. Imagine if it produced that food in a way that restored the land. Imagine if we could eat every meal knowing these few simple things. What it is we're eating, where it came from, how it found its way to our table, and what it really cost. It was from that reality then that every meal would have the potential to be a perfect meal. We would not need to go hunting for our connection to our food and the web of life that produces it. We would no longer need any reminding that we eat by the grace of nature, not industry, and that what we're eating is never anything more or less than the body of the world. I don't want to have to forage every meal. Most people don't want to learn to garden or hunt. But we can change the way we make and get our food so that it becomes food again. Something that feeds our bodies and our souls. Imagine it. Every meal would connect us to the joy of living and the wonder of nature. Every meal would be like saying grace.